Hello, I'm going to talk about the Colonial Era, which is 1636 to 1789. Establishing the collegiate forms in English colonies in America, three characteristics affected their development most. First, settlers were determined to form a new way of life, different from the governmental and ancestral formalities they had left back in Europe. Second, the land was a limitless horizon for them to reach different areas whenever tired of their previous lands. Finally, religion was one of the largest sparks of this time period in establishing such forms. In a societal context, for most settlers, the New World represented a chance for a new start. Although immigrants had been arriving in the Western Hemisphere for more than 100 years, no lasting English settlement occurred until the beginning of the 17th century. Virginia was the first colony settled in 1607, and all but one of the colonies was formed by the end of the century. Georgia was the last of the original 13, settling in 1732. As each colony began to form, differences began to take place. Each one differed from the others based on the climate and religion, mores, and the social pattern characteristics of its early settlers. Each group stamped its lifestyle so precise on its environment, speech patterns and accents, attitudes toward learning and aging, child-rearing practices, and many other ways that still persist to this day. By the middle of the 18th century, the country was large enough to allow for continual reformation in all aspects of colonial life. New forms of religious observance and fresh ideas in everything from the building of settlements to child rearing could emerge in the vast spaces available. The openness of the land and the people emerging within it began to find there were few restrictions on entering professions. Apprenticeships were the major form of access to professions. Clergymen were both preachers and teachers, and congregations tended to value those who were schooled. University graduates, who could hurl about quotations in original Hebrew and Greek and lawfully demonstrate their superior familiarity with Scripture, enjoyed a strategic advantage. Hanlon and Hanlon, 1971. The development of literacy did not depend on schooling. Many colonists had little association with print other than the family Bible. Their familiarity with ideas came through words delivered by a preacher. When the American Revolution was born, colonists began to gain a sense of uniqueness. Most colonists had no trouble holding compartmentalized notions of freedom, one for themselves, another for their slaves and servants. The all men are created equal phrase of the Declaration of Independence proved fit, but was a statement that was argued and reinterpreted infinite times throughout the new nation's history. Institutions began to organize on American settlement, and 9 colleges that were organized in the colonies were molded on educational forms that had been developed in Europe over the previous 500 years. The elements of all institutional types over previous centuries can be found in higher education today. However, at the time of the founding of the colonial colleges, the pattern of curriculum and faculty-student relations stemming from church-related institutions was most prominent. As mentioned earlier, religion was a major influence in the colonial colleges. Some colleges had a mission to Christianize and civilize the native people. The colonists wanted to build communities that integrated religion with society. By bringing in these colleges, they brought prestige to the communities that needed to show that they were centers of civility. The desire to build unified communities with strong religious orientation was powerful, and the belief that civil government needed educated leaders was prominent as well. Only 3 colleges were built prior to the middle of the 18th century, but 6 more between then and the founding of the nation. These 9 colleges laid the foundation for instructional practices. Harvard College, currently Harvard University, was established in 1636, standing as the first college to be created. Dartmouth College was the last of the 9 to be established, concluding in year 1769. But although there were only few, they affected lasting public perceptions of what a true college should be. Toward the end of the colonial era, the religious orientation faded and the idea of civil community entered on principles of morality and public service. Apart from the established church grew. In 1749, Benjamin Franklin wrote about the purposes of education and how an institution should be molded in his proposals relating to the education of youth in Pennsylvania in which he also outlined the institution that would become the University of Pennsylvania. Students who attended schooling in the American colonies were few and far between. Many either had no need to go to college or it was not accessible to them. Enrollments were small. The total number of resident students at any of the colonial colleges was usually less than 100, and the graduating class could be numbered in single digits. In most colonial families, few could afford to send their children to college. The notion of work study developed from students being unable to pay tuition. Most students who attended college followed in careers indicating the purpose for which these students attended. Most became either ministers, physicians, teachers, lawyers, public servants, or a combination of these. College life was designed as a system for controlling the often vigorous youth and for instilling in them discipline, morals, and character. Students were expected to attend lectures and tutorials, obey the rules, and avoid the presence of dishonorable people. Also, many young males that were sent to college by their families were seen to need discipline. Throughout the era, the teaching profession was struggling to be born. Faculty were often known and understood as tutors and typically were recent graduates who were awaiting positions as ministers. The pay was minimal and began to function as both instructors and guardians responsible for student behavior. Unlike lawyers and physicians, who expected to be paid for their job well done, faculty were more like volunteers engaged in public service. But for some, tutoring and attempting to shape young minds had more appeal than working out in the farming fields. Whether curriculum is defined as a set of courses or the whole experiences that the college designs for its students, it is always rationalized as being practical. Curriculum is directed towards forming young people, their character formation, preparation for careers, access to society, language, and manners. A knowledge of rhetoric, classical scholarship, and the Bible was occupational preparation for lawyers, ministers, and statesmen in the colonial era. Science and mathematics entered the practical curriculum toward the end of the era as many students prepared for commercial careers. The curriculum in the colonial colleges was a direct import from Europe with little modification until the later half of the 18th century. The colonial colleges prepared learned men using a liberal arts curriculum that was considered the best preparation for people who would take their place in any walk of society. They learned far more than how to perform a single job. A major portion of the curriculum in colonial colleges was derived from the 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, logic, astronomy, arithmetic, geometry, and music. The liberal arts were then adapted for religious purposes and modified to add various forms of philosophy and ethics. Also, the Scottish universities had been reforming themselves throughout the 18th century and were becoming influential on the form of the colleges in the colonies. They had begun assigning specific subjects to professors, which laid the path for academic specialization. They also began breaking away from the idea of a prescribed curriculum, where each student studies the same subject, and they began to include scientific and reasoning in their practices. Methods of instruction are central to studies of curriculum. Not only what is taught, but how it is taught is at the core of the collegiate experience even to this day. Although complete descriptions of teaching methods are not available, researchers have been able to piece together reports of students describing their experience in the classes, the rules governing instruction, and the reminiscence of the tutors. Grammar was learned through memorization and analogical reasoning. Until the end of the era, very few textbooks had been written for college teaching. Tutors lectured and students would recite what has been said. Readings were also assigned in whatever books the college was able to acquire for its small library. Each of the 9 colleges had a library, but were often just a core collection donated by a local book collector, except for Harvard's 12,000 volumes. Students were supposed to be able to translate from Greek to Latin, but few could do so. Writing and speaking in Latin was similarly difficult for students. The evolution of curriculum in the colonial era is shown in the change from a curriculum based on church doctrine to one based on a worldly humanism values revealed through Greek and Latin texts, to one in which science replaced divine revelation as the ultimate standard. The governance of colonial institutions foreshadowed issues of governance in higher education throughout history. Colleges were founded with a combination of public and private control. The extent of control to be exerted by the Board of Trustees, as contrasted with the members of the college community itself, was always in question, although the board was certainly in control of all the important issues. 3 of the colonial colleges established a dual governing structure, in which the lay Board of Trustees shared power with the internal group of college fellows. In the other 6 colleges, the lay board had authority over all functions. The combination of lay board trustees, strong presidents, a weak professorate, and an absence of central ministry of higher education throughout American history served to perpetuate the governance patterns that were established early on. Colonial colleges depended financially on voluntary contributions and on contributions of funds coming from various other sources, from sponsoring church groups, subscribers or private donations, and from other governmental bodies. College was not for the sons of the poor. Only families that could afford it, or to send its sons away to school, could usually spare some money for tuition. None of the colonial colleges were well endowed. The pattern of trying to raise money continually, of spending all that could be raised, and of living in a refined poverty continued well into the future of practically all of the colleges in the nation. Students that attended college had many beneficial outcomes. These included career preparation, individual mobility, assistance in child rearing, the idea of the institution as an archive, and such intangibles as community pride. People had to learn to be versatile. The colleges prepared learned men using liberal arts, curriculum that was considered the best preparation for people who would take their place in any walk of society. Colleges continually strive to demonstrate their values to a broader community. The colonial colleges also provided an avenue of mobility for young men, prepared ministers, and assisted in the formation and maintenance of an elite group of public servants at the time when there was no specialized training for government, teaching, librarianships, or medical practice. Overall, colonial colleges served as symbols of community pride, and an institution of higher learning distinguished a civilized community from an unlettered settlement in the wilderness.